Good morning, everyone. First off, thank you very much for this opportunity for presenting today to the audience. My name is Sobhith. I'm working with Lloyds Register in our Singapore office. And my main role is in sort of supporting ship owners and charterers in new build projects, in decarbonization, adoption of alternate fuels and all of that. So today, what I would like to present is also on one of those projects that we are working with on the application of methanol as a fuel for container ship projects. So we will discuss briefly on some of the factors related to decarbonization. In terms of adopting this on board a container ship, what are some of the things that we need to put in place? And how can we sort of address some of the risks associated with this, its application? So just a brief word about Lloyds Register. We are a marine classification society and fundamentally engaged with the safe application of systems on board and propulsion systems on board, and also in the marine and offshore related aspects. So first off, maybe a brief intro into why we're discussing about methanol or other alternate fuels. So on the left, what we see is the greenhouse gas reduction strategy by IMO. So at least looking at getting a 50% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And on the right, what we see is the how the industry might respond in terms of adoption of other alternative fuels, for instance, LNG, methanol, ammonia, or the likes, to actually get into compliance with the GHG reduction strategy. So essentially, we might see a peak of oil fuel fleet being built within the next couple of years, and adoption of other fuels sort of taking up by end of this particular decade. So briefly onto methanol, just looking at some of the pros and challenges. So if we look at one of the aspects in terms of the pros, it has been widely used as a chemical in the process industry. And in terms of transporting it on board, it has also been extensively carried on board chemical tankers, and there is extensive in-service experience with its carriage on board. It, as opposed to some of the other fuels, like for instance LNG or ammonia, methanol can also be just stored in liquid form at ambient conditions, so and also able to be kept on board on integral tanks, for instance, without consuming much space as what we would need for LNG or ammonia. But on the other hand, there are also some challenges. For instance, it is also toxic and also corrosive to a certain extent. And there is also an aspect of energy density there, so it's less energy dense than what we would have for LNG or heavy fuel oil. So that would mean for the same endurance for the vessel, we have to carry at least twice what we would get for the other fuels. In terms of maybe infrastructure and availability, so we know this is being produced extensively now, mostly from non-renewable sources, for instance, coal or natural gas. And there are close to maybe almost 90 production plants and close to around 100 bunkering pods currently available, where we can actually also perhaps bunker this fuel on board ships. But then there are also a consideration for producing this methanol on a more renewable basis. So instead of perhaps from natural gas or coal-based, there should be provision now for increasing amount of biomass-related methanol production or production from renewable sources. So that will be important going forward, because IMO will also be adopting the life cycle greenhouse gas emission regulations soon. So how is the statistics looking in terms of the adoption on the marine fleet? We are looking at close to around 15 vessels in service and close to around 26 vessels on order. And it's expected that by 2030, we could probably see close to around 80 vessels in operation. So how is the regulatory environment looking? So in terms of carrying this on board as a cargo on chemical tankers, there is extensive regulations in place, and in-service experience is also very good. So MARPOL Annex 2 and also the IBC code. But in terms of the fuel, the regulations are still being developed. So there is an interim guidelines come out from the IMO, taking into account of the requirements that we have from the IGF code. And class societies like ours, for instance, LR, we have also produced our own rules for the application of methanol as fuel on board. But then we are still going through an alternative risk-based methodology, so which I will explain a bit more in detail later on. So how about the technology readiness? So we are looking at if we having methanol as a fuel on board, do we have sufficient number of engines or fuel process systems which can be installed on board? So the answer is yes. So we have a considerable number of engines currently in service for large two-stroke engines. And also there are medium speed engines which are capable of running on methanol, and there are also conversion kits forthcoming from some of the engine makers. So we also saw smaller engines being converted on smaller vessels to run on methanol. So from that technology front, this is currently available and ready. So just briefly onto the case vessel. So just to see if we are adopting this on board a vessel now, in this case for a container ship, what are maybe some of the systems that we need to put on board. So this is actually this case vessel is being considered as part of a wider study that we're actually doing for the feeder vessel fleet operating between Singapore and Hong Kong. So this vessel is a 3000 TEU class vessel. So we looked at having this on board close to a capacity of 3,500 cubic. So we will have maybe an endurance of close to 10,000 nautical miles and with a service speed of close to 18 knots. So this is briefly still an early stage project. So when we say methanol as a fuel on board, what perhaps is on a high level is required to be installed on board. So we're looking at provisions for storage. So there'll be storage tanks that are required. And then there is low pressure pumps to transfer and also higher pressure pumps like to bring up the temperature and pressure conditions. We also have the high pressure pumps and also perhaps a heat exchanger unit. And then there is a fuel valve train that's actually sort of a block and bleed arrangement mainly for safety purposes and also controlling the purging sequences for the engine. And then there is the consumers, for instance, main engines or the other engines that we have to put on board for using methanol as a fuel. And then since this is a liquid fuel, there should be some provision for returning the fuel. So it could be a drain tank and also maybe a separate service tank. So just a high level on some of the things that we have to put on board. So once these additional systems are put on board, there are a number of risks or associated hazards coming up as a result. So how do we sort of address this? Yes, there are regulations developed to a certain extent, but we still go through the risk assessment process, running this through a hazard workshop with a number of SMEs in attendance. So it could be a hazard workshop, then progressing on to more detailed hazard workshops or FMEA studies need to be done for specific aspects and as identified in the workshop. And we have also produced a set of guidelines on how these should be undertaken, to what level need to be reviewed and all of that. So how is this then sort of applied to the particular case vessel that we looked at? So briefly looking at one specific node, so one specific section from the system that we looked at. So it's maybe the bunkering station, for instance, for provision of bunkering. So during a bunkering operation, there could be hazards due to methanol leakage, which could then come to give fire considerations, or for instance, fuel contamination issues. And if you're looking at perhaps locating this bunkering station on a passenger ship or maybe even for a container vessel, we are looking at the hazards to people on board from the toxicity of this spilled methanol. So once we analyze this on the specific context of a ship, then we could look at some of the preventive measures that can be implemented. For instance, provision of showers or emergency shutdown systems, firefighting arrangements, provisions for vapor detection, all of that. So just to give another illustration on onboard storage arrangements, so we're looking at the storage tank. There could be structural integrity considerations, prevent the hazards from collision risk. So once we know these as the specific risk, then we could take sort of measures, for instance, locating this in a protective location, provision for maybe a coffer dam, arrangements for ventilation, and if you have a pressure relief valve coming out from a tank, then locating this far away from the places where people can be, like maybe, for instance, accommodation areas or air intake spaces for the engine room. So these are some of, and again, putting forward some of the structural fire protection arrangements, separating these spaces from other high-risk areas. So these are some of the things that are required to be then put on board. So just maybe to summarize, so we looked at the technology. The technology is actually ready and available. A number of engines are in operation. Sufficient in-service experience is also there. In terms of regulations, these are developing well in place to a certain extent. And as the production source for methanol improves, then we could perhaps see more and more renewable-based methanol being produced and in a such way addressing the life cycle emissions challenge. By going through a sort of a risk-based methodology, then we could also specifically identify the risk on each vessel and then perhaps propose measures that can be more cost-effective and optimal for a specific vessel's installation. So with that, and I'll conclude. Thank you again very much. If there are any questions, we'll be happy to
Thank
answer.
you.
Thanks.
Thanks for the very informative presentation. Questions, please? All right.
Okay, thank you for the interesting presentation. I would like to ask maybe just one question for your personal opinion. It's about competition between methanol and LNG. So we know that they are actually methanol and LNG, right? They are competing for their feedstock. Even for the fossil LNG, methanol is coming from the natural gas as well. For the future, like the bio-based methanol, it will be actually coming from, let's say, the same feedstock, actually as compared with bio-LNG. And even for the renewable methanol, we are actually competing for the hydrogen source. So I want to understand your opinion about these two potential alternative fuels. Which one do you think it will be better or cheaper, or maybe just in your opinion?
Okay, thank you very much. So I feel, I think this is a very pertinent question, all of us being always asked. But one of the things we also see coming up is there may not be like one fuel over the other. So it could be sort of a very good mixture in terms of perhaps we will see LNG vessels operating methanol vessels and also perhaps vessels using ammonia as fuel. But as you rightly mentioned, it should in some point transition to bio-based, for instance, bio-LNG perhaps coming in and also bio-based methanol coming in. So in terms of competing for a feedstock for these two sources, it could only, the market forces could then sort of decide in terms of what could be more economically produced, if it's going to be bio-LNG or is it going to be biomethanol. So from that aspect, I would see it would then there'll be the market forces. So for instance, perhaps as you mentioned, rightfully mentioned, the carbon pricing that would really come in and see, for instance, to what extent we could perhaps look at providing maybe a bio-based LNG or maybe an e-LNG, for instance, from renewable-based sources. So the same for biomethanol or maybe a e-methanol. So what could be financially feasible to be provided and to cater to the total operating cost of a vessel. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, there is another question.
Thank you very much. In fact, I noticed you're definitely very experienced new build classification society guy. Could you share the owner perspective who adopted the methanol? What's the top 3 reasons they adopt? And the other group of owners, they were not adopting it. And why the top 3 reasons they don't want to go into it? I appreciate you can share that.
Sure, thanks. So I think maybe one of the primary reasons why it's being increasingly adopted, to answer that part, is the properties of the fuel itself. So for instance, if we are looking at perhaps LNG or ammonia, then we are actually looking at providing additional sort of space to have a containment system. So for instance, LNG, we could either have type B tanks or membrane tanks or even tanks, type C tanks that are located on deck. So we need to specifically cater space for accommodating these on board. But for methanol, it's easier to get, it's liquid at ambient conditions, so it's not really cryogenic. So we can actually store that within a hull integral tanks and all of that. So from that storage perspective itself, there is some interest. Then there is the in-service. Second part is the in-service experience. So we're looking at close to around 15 vessels in operation and close to around 26 vessels being ordered. So the engines are ready. So if there is sufficient confidence for ship owners to actually then commit that, yes, if we commit for methanol, we could get the engines, we could get the fuel systems, we could train the people on board, right? Then, of course, maybe the third reason, what I could see is the the increasing interest generally from the community. For instance, we see Maersk making a big leap and making the commitment to adopt methanol. But so that would actually give confidence to also a number of other ship owners to go the same route. But then maybe what are some of the reasons why the owners are not really committing? So I could think of the availability. So the availability currently is also quite limited for non-green methanol. Green, now currently what we have is mostly from gray or black methanol. So this is going to have some concerns in terms of the availability for green methanol. So that's actually preventing the adoption in one aspect. Then more importantly, the financial aspect. So if you're looking at maybe green methanol now, the cost associated with its use is huge. And unless we have carbon pricing, which is actually going to compensate for that huge difference in operational cost, it's going to be very difficult for owners to make that decision. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely agree, because there are so many different types of methanol, like e-methanol, biomethanol, right? So very interesting. Thanks again.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.